Okay, Prof. Thanks very much. As I said, my first question relates to the obvious, the obvious historical origins of the Afrikaans language. For the benefit of our listeners, if we were doing language 101,
Yes.
in terms of date, in terms of location, in terms of the different cultural articulations at the time, where would you say, how would you characterize the origins of Afrikaans?
Well, most languages actually develop in a context, and in this particular context, Afrikaans developed as a language of contact between the European circumnavigators around the Cape, the merchants around the Cape, and eventually the settlers who settled, the European settlers who settled here in the Cape, and the indigenous people, the Khoi people at that time, and later enslaved people who arrived here as slaves at the Cape as well. So if we track that development back, it's probably around, say, 400 years. One must remember that the first contact that the circumnavigators had with the indigenous people of Southern Africa was around the mid-16th century, even earlier, into the 15th century, we take it that far. But the most traffic, probably, or a lot of traffic, happened around that time, at about the 16th century. So that's about, say, the 1500s, mid to the late 1500s. So, and we can actually track that. When the European settlement happened after 1652, we had people, for instance, Otmahu, who was able to speak in English, who had some English, and he even addressed Van Riebeeck in Dutch at that time. So already there was a smattering of signs of contact. So, and that's then the development that gave rise to what we today call Afrikaans. So that is the language of contact. And that often happens. It happens all over the world, whether it happens in Europe, whether it happens in Southeast Asia or the Americas. Those are the kinds of developments that one would get where people are in contact. The same thing happened with Genghis Khan and his marauding troops in China, what we today know as China, and Iran, and Iraq, and those places.
And here in South Africa, you say that I'm thinking the different sort of white contact languages that contribute in what is now called Afrikaans. If I'm correct, it's except Dutch, it would be Khoi, it would be Arabic. Is there any other language?
Well, if we look at that, that's a variety of languages. Obviously, first one must also distinguish one other thing, and that is that local languages, there were numerous, as far as we know today, there were numerous Khoi languages, for instance, at the Cape, because because people were relatively isolated as well.
Yeah.
So you had people, different groups of people in what we today know as the Cape Peninsula, in what was called the Southern Cape, for instance, a different grouping. To the northern parts of what we today know as the Northern Cape, there were different groupings. Inland, there were different groupings, and in some cases, these people could not necessarily did not share one language, as we know today. Similarly, there were the San people, although they were nomads, basically, they didn't necessarily share the same language with the Khoi people. And then further on, you had people around the Eastern Cape, what we today know as the Eastern Cape, who also shared a different language, the languages. So these languages were not, these speakers were not necessarily, or the languages were not mutually intelligible to one another often. So they had to find some way of connecting to whoever the new power was at the time. So if you look at that kind of development, language always comes with power. You know, there's a saying in linguistic literature that the difference between a dialect and a language has often to do with who owns the canon, you know, who has the canon. So power always determines who's in control, and everybody has to adapt to that, the power in control, or the power in that particular location. So that happens all over the world, whether it's China or English or Spanish or Russian or whatever the case might be. So the language of power is always the one that becomes the dominant one in a particular location, as happened in the case of the European Dutch settlement. So those languages that was existing here, you know, we do not necessarily have a record of them at that time. We do have a record of them as they were written up eventually by those who could record them in a literary form. So we find, for instance, that at some of the first travelogues that we get in the late 17th or the mid 17th century, we find words, for instance, a word like I'm just thinking now, a word like dacha, for instance. So it's one of the first words that a word like buba for cow, for instance. A word like hamka for lion. A word like aqua for what appeared to be a horse, for instance. Those were some of the first words that the travelers wrote down. And then you would have, for instance, the Khoi people called air, chow, or it was, when that was the way it was written down, CHOU. They probably pronounced it completely differently, but that was the way it was written down. A pathway, for instance, was called, let me just think now, dodo. That was a road. That was, a pathway. So as you could see there that some of those first words, if you can, lexical items. The first recordings of those words were written up by the traveler, with the travelers at the time, and they gave us an insight into the existence of a particular language and the way that people name their environment, because that's also part of that history, the way that they name their environment. So in that sense, we have a clear idea that there were, different languages being spoken at that time, prior to European settlement.
Linguistically speaking, I want to converse two things. One is, what is the difference between a dialect and a language?
Well, that's actually a very difficult question, as I just explained earlier. I'm not a linguist, but I'll try my layman's version of that. I think in terms of the language is far more developed infrastructurally, far more developed, and it's adapting to a particular context, whether it's technological, whether it's socially, and it's spoken over a far greater regional context, regional environment. Whereas dialects are often regarded as confined to a particular place, to a particular region, for instance. And there are various forms of those kind of dialects that we talk about. We can, bring it down to the individual, to a region, to a specific social group, and so on. So there are various. That's all with under the broader term dialect would be all various kinds of smaller identifications of language itself, forms of language, an idiolect or a sociolect, and all of those will determine a particular specificity. But dialect itself, then, the language is fairly developed. It's more than one region often. It is not confined to a particular social group or a particular region. So I think that is part of the distinction between language and dialect.
So when we look at Afrikaans, like vis-a-vis Dutch, infrastructurally, from a linguistic point of view, to what extent is it really a separate language and not just a Dutch dialect with sort of adaptations that were dictated or were brought about by it being in interaction in the southern part of the African continent with Malaysians, the Khoi, and some of the Arab speakers?
Let me say, that's an easier way to answer that. And that is that Afrikaans would not have been Afrikaans if it wasn't for those influences. Afrikaans is completely different in that sense from Dutch. For instance, it's a simplified language. It hasn't got all those declensions, for instance, of Dutch. It's less complicated in terms of its structure. If we look at the variety of words and lexical items, it's very different. You can't use, for instance, a common South African or Afrikaans word is baie. You can't use baie in Dutch. Nobody would understand you. There might be words that look similar, but it's very different. It's pronounced differently. Structurally, it's very different. And in quite a number of cases, for instance, when you get a Dutch speaker who, for the first time, encounters Afrikaans, he or she would not be able to understand it, simply because when it's spoken at a normal rhythm, they wouldn't be able to understand that. But once they figured out aspects of the language, they would be able to sort of go around that and find a way of understanding what's happening. But it's not necessary. It's a common misunderstanding to say that Afrikaans and Dutch is mutually intelligible for everyone. For instance, for a Dutch speaker or for an Afrikaans speaker, mutually. So I would argue that there's a very distinct difference in the languages itself. In terms of Afrikaans, for instance, the variety of influences, the structural influences of the local languages and the Southeast Asian languages on the former Dutch, in the former colony, influenced Dutch to a far greater extent than we could have imagined at the time. For instance, in just structurally, what is commonly known as double negative, for instance. In Afrikaans, for instance, the ni is part and parcel of the language. That's not used in Dutch at all. a concept like, say, we often use the concept of what is called reduplication. For instance, Bafana Bafana in Afrikaans, no, no, for instance. Now the reduplication is a very African element. So you would find that in most African languages, you will find this, as I just made the example of Bafana Bafana or else. That reduplication you find only in Afrikaans. If you look at in Dutch, you do not get that kind of thing. So there are, if you sit down and pin down those differences, there are quite a number of them.
Just juxtaposing the ideas of Afrikaans as a language with I think it's Hemengiliomi or Hiliomi. I don't know. I never know how to pronounce the name. Yes. Who puts the sort of date of the first person to refer to themselves as Afrikaner in and around Stellenbosch around 1707. But it's something that sort of self-identification of a group of white settlers as Afrikaners, as something that in a way concretized after almost 50 to 60 years of settlement in the Cape. What would have the language been called before, and at what point does the language get associated only in this case with sort of white former or descendants of the Dutch?
You're asking me three questions now. Let me start with the first one. The first one is the reference to Hendrik Bibo.
Yes.
The Hendrik Bibo story where he said, I am an Afrikaner. One must remember that nationalisms are built through myths, stories and myths. The story of Hendrik Bibo is the cultivation of a particular myth into a nationalist symbol, nationalist cornerstone. The story of Hendrik Bibo, if you remember, was of this 17, 18-year-old young man who was drunk on a Sunday afternoon or Saturday afternoon. I don't remember correctly now. But anyway, he was drunk. I think it was a Sunday afternoon, and he was in a commotion at a particular mill in Stellenbosch, and the magistrate Starrenberg gave him a hiding because he was disturbing the peace. And his reaction to this was, I am an Afrikaner, meaning I'm born here.
Yeah.
And he was uttering that to Starrenberg, who was not born here. So that relationship was one of saying that, you're an outsider, you are a makweri, you can use a local term, and I'm a local one. That story was almost forgotten for 150 years, more than 100 years. In 1928 or 1930, I think, 1928, probably more, it was written up by a Belgian historian in a magazine called Die Huisgenoot. And what happened in Die Huisgenoot, that story became part of Afrikaner nationalism, where this story itself became a cornerstone for the first one to call himself an Afrikaner. So one must distinguish between myth, namely that this person, this drunken young man, was acting in a nationalistic way. Was saying, I am an Afrikaner, as for instance saying, I'm and pronouncing on a course, some sort of political course. It was built into a myth by the culture brokers of the 1930s, and that was sold to a broader grouping of people who was trying to find their own sense of identity in South Africa. And we need to understand that kind of linkage. It's not to derive the story. It's to put that particular story in the context of myth-making and nationalism and the way in which nationalisms work to define their identity. And that happens to nationalism throughout the world. The second question you asked was in relation to what was the language called at that time. It was called, there are a variety of languages in the mid-18th century. It was called Cape Dutch, it was called Broken Dutch, it was particularly called Hottentot Dutch, namely Dutch of the Khoi people. And it was also in the beginning, around the mid-18th century, it was called Slave Dutch. So, and that and those names are quite apt at the time, simply because that was the language used. It was, as I said earlier, it was a contact language. It was also the adaptations of these subject people to come to grips with this language of those in power at the time. So at that time it was known as, it had all these various labels. And what is interesting, if we look at literature, the literary output at the time, is that these people were derided in dramas, in dramatic performances at the Cape, in comedies at the Cape, where people were made fun of, the speakers of Hottentot Dutch, were made fun of in these dramatic presentations, the comedies and so forth. And there are people like Thomas Bain, for instance, and Charles Boniface at the beginning of the 19th century. If we look at the dramatic presentations at that time, they were making fun of these people and these languages. So that in itself is an indication of the way in which the language was perceived, because at that time there were two different versions, or a more variety of versions of Dutch. On the one hand, you had these slaves and indigenous Khoi people and their language. Mostly that was regarded as what we today know as Cape Dutch, for instance. But we also had people who moved inland, as the trade Boers, for instance. And the trade Boers were, a variety of people who wanted to be outside of the realm of the colony. They spoke a particular language, which was also a mixture of contact languages. And because these people were up from a variety of backgrounds, and they moved into what is called the hinterland. And then you had people called the so-called oorlands. Those are people who were westernized, local indigenous people who were westernized, could use weapons, and they moved to the north of what we today know as the Northern Cape, to Namibia and so on. And today we know that it's Garib Afrikaans or Garib Dutch. It was called at that time. It didn't have a name, but if you look at people like Jager Afrikaner in the mid 19th century, or Ouderam Afrikaner in the early 19th century, they moved into what was called Namibia, or what we call today Namibia, that was outside of the bounds of the colony. So that happened, in the late 18th, early 19th century. So that language had a variety of names, as I just indicated. And then your third question is, when did Afrikaans become Afrikaans as we know it today? That is a process of modernization, and that happened towards the end of the 19th century, towards the beginning of the 20th century, and more actively through the activity of what was then the beginning of what was called the beginning of after the Anglo-Boer War. You must remember that, but after the Anglo-Boer War was this fight against Imperial Britain, and South Africa then became a union. And part of that process was the process of language and what I would call the re-Dutchification of Afrikaans. So there were active processes of having a language, this local language, which was known by all these various names, to form that into a language that was standardized, have its grammatical rule settles and so forth. That happened more actively in the beginning of the 20th century, although there were early examples in the late 19th century as well. Okay. So that's the kind of transition that happened. But one also needs to understand is that language deals, and those processes, connects to something else that we often do not speak about. And that is the question of literacy and recording, as I said earlier. Because languages often we do not recognize the language or the contributors to that language because we do not have a recording of them.
Yeah.
And some of those first recordings of that the new language happened in Arabic Afrikaans, and that happened in the mosques and the madrasas of Cape Town at the beginning of the 19th century, the end of the 18th century, so the early 1800s onwards, where you had in Arabic script, the local language being written up. And we've got very clear examples of that in the 1830s to the 1840s to the 1860s. So that is quite clear that we have this particular development of the Metropolitan Dutch being changed into what we today know as Afrikaans as early as the 1830s and the 1840s, where it had a recognizable identity in Arabic Afrikaans.
My final question relates to that particular sort of struggle to constantly wrestle the language as a language of power, exclusion, and ultimately a language of white supremacy. I guess, you've dedicated majority of your work to proving precisely the opposite, that the language is far more inclusive. Afrikaans is far more inclusive in both its development, but also the language speakers of Afrikaans goes beyond a people that wanted to keep it as a language of white people. When you judge today the place of Afrikaans in South Africa's cultural, social, and economic centers of interaction and centers of power, is Afrikaans becoming, as it were, the language that was not what it was in apartheid? Meaning, is it now more inclusive? Is it now the language that has nothing to do with the preservation of white supremacy? And could one, by speaking it, as it were, undermine, by developing it, undermine the supremacist narrative and the supremacist emotions that it often inspires within the more conservative sections of the Afrikaners?
Yeah, let me put it that way. Those of us who've grown up in in the large part of the 20th century, always felt, I mean, some people like myself, always felt that one of the main problems that we have around Afrikaans is that it is too closely identified with the Afrikaner. It reminds me of the Marxist saying that, the power of dominance always, spreads its own ideas, and everybody starts believing that. Afrikaans has always been the language of the poor and the marginalized, in my experience. It has always been the language of poor people. It has always been the language of those on the margins. And that has been so since its inception. And when the nationalists, Afrikaner nationalists, usurped and used it for their as part of their identity, it existed. The language of poor people existed, and it only, it was never recognized. It was suppressed. It was undermined. It was excluded, and it is quite interesting that it's sort of rediscovered. But it has always been there, and it has always been there in its present form, in the variety of that form. It doesn't mean that because of the language, the formal processes, which I think is necessary. I mean, those formal processes were necessary. The process of standardization, poor people do not have access to power in ways that allow them, for instance, to use it in particular ways. In the upper echelons of power, to use it in the formal written form, and so forth. That's one thing. And I need to make a distinction, and I always make that distinction between Afrikaans as it's spoken in the southern parts of the country and Afrikaans in the northern parts of the country, because I think there are two different ways in which the language came about. In the northern parts of the country, the language arrived, so to speak, on an ox wagon, in a way. In the southern parts of the country, it was very much formed in the mouths of people. People were struggled through it. If you trace people's histories, the language of subjugation and the language of survival was Afrikaans. It's in there. It's very much ingrained in their own history. You cannot speak about the history of slavery in South Africa without speaking about the way in which people came from across the world, or at least parts of the world, the Atlantic, border Atlantic, and East and West Africa, to come to this country, do not have a language in common, and then through an act of survival, because that's what Afrikaans actually is. It's an act of survival. It was a mode of survival for them. And we do not tell that story from the point of view of the poor and the impoverished. We always only tell the story of the rich and the powerful. So, and if we do not tell the story of those people who survived through harsh circumstances and survived in ways that made them human, that created their own humanity, we're not telling the full story of Afrikaans.
Yeah.
So I think one needs to, and often I argue that we today speak about decolonization in those kind of terms, but we do not recognize the contribution through blood and labor of those people who survived through the harshest of enslaved traditions in Southern Africa. I mean, slavery in South Africa is often regarded as milder as opposed to other slaveries in slave societies in the rest of the world, which is not true. I mean, it has been as harsh as anywhere else in the world. And to have survived those circumstances in South Africa, in Southern African terms, for over 150 years, speaks to a great sense of resilience. And we do not, we often undermine people's sense of themselves by deriding that kind of history. So we need to have the sense of the way in which we look at the language. We often, and in the North, that often happens, that people do not necessarily have that history. They do not have access to that history, and that history hasn't been told. In fact, that history has never been taught at any of our schools, because again, it is, the powerful decides what their story is. But the other stories, the neglected stories, the undermined stories, those stories never been told in ways that are accessible.
Okay. That's Professor Hein Willemse giving us an extensive history of the Afrikaans language. As I indicated, Bandana Bengosi, Afrikaans in terms of official recognition is 100 years this year. I think there'll be quite a number of celebrations from about Thursday or so within the Afrikaans-speaking circles. But we are now joined by Professor Lolie Makhubu-Badenhorst, who is the chairperson of the Pan-South African Language Board. Welcome to Power Talk, Prof, and thanks deeply for holding.
Good morning to you, Dr. Ndlozi, and good morning to your listeners. And thank you for having me. Or should I say, goeiemorgen?
Goeiemorgen indeed. But please don't proceed. I guess by a month like mania. So, Prof, just for basic benefit of our listeners, what does the Language Board do? What is its mandate?
Well, the Pan-South African Language Board, it was established, it is an Act 59 of 1995, as amended in 1999. So, why was it established, this Act, or Pan-South was established? It is two parts. First, it's to provide for the recognition, implementation, and furtherance of multilingualism in the country. That is one aspect. And the other aspect, it is to develop the previously marginalized languages in South Africa. So we promote, we implement, and also we develop the previously marginalized. But the mandate of the Pan-South African Language Board is to support, promote, and protect all the South African languages, and also to create the environment for effective multilingualism in the country.
And, well, I mean, okay, let's firstly roll out the state of Afrikaans in the country today. By population, as well as the schools, as well as, within the arts, film, television, radio. What is the state by numbers of Afrikaans today?
Well, the Afrikaans is spoken by about 6 million plus population in the country, and it's widespread all over, the 9 provinces. But it's predominant in the certain parts of, obviously Gauteng, Western Cape, Northern Cape, and the Eastern Cape, and so on. But, in each and every part of our country, you do find, Afrikaans. And also, strange enough, when if I may then include that, us growing up, none of us were African speakers in the townships, but we were playing Skop the Ball. And we're using Afrikaans. And even today, our children, we don't say kick the ball, kahleli ball, raha ball. We still call it skop the ball. And none of us are African. So Afrikaans is all over. So that's why I'm a language activist and I'm in the board. And that's what we are doing as the board, promoting all South African languages, including Afrikaans.
Of the 6 million or so South Africans who use Afrikaans as their sort of a daily and home language, Are you able to give us the racial breakdown?
Unfortunately, I may not give you the racial breakdown. I'm just merely a linguist myself and a language activist. However, I will then be able to tell you that it is not only the white population that speak Afrikaans. We have all the other population that speak the Afrikaans, the language.
Okay. But then in terms of the language board, this idea, or rather the centenary of the Afrikaans language, what are the programs that the board will be embarking on in its mandate of promotion and all of that?
You must remember that as the board, be any language, we do not necessarily then start or take the initiative per se, but whoever is celebrating, be it Sesotho, isiZulu, Setswana, and Afrikaans for that matter, if they are having some celebrations, activities, and events, we as the board, we join in and then we put some resources in support of those languages. However, our mandate at the moment, we also are worried about those languages that are about to be extinct. However, in terms of developing the languages that are, in terms of supporting the other languages that are in existence, we make sure that we support, we promote, and we offer whatever assistance that we can as by law to do that.
Over the years, Afrikaans has been understood as the language of the oppressor, and that being the case, particularly as it relates, for instance, to its role in the hands of the white supremacists of Apartheid. What has the board done to sort of empower those sections of the population that do speak Afrikaans that are not white, African people that speak Afrikaans, colored people, to sort of include them in terms of literature, in terms of film, in terms of all other artistic prerogatives, to sort of make it a truly a language that is inclusive, and a language of those that apartheid may have excluded in trying to use it as a language of white supremacy?
Well, maybe let me start with, I know that you touched on the film industry or the entertainment industry. Maybe as an academic myself, let me start in academia.
Yeah.
That, as, I'm sure you, I don't know if you are aware that the Department of Higher Education and Training have ring-fenced some money for the universities, all 26 public universities in the country, to implement or to align their language policies to the framework of 2020 and to be multilingual. And when in aligning their languages, one of the languages that is recognized by various universities is Afrikaans. And I actually can safely say that I am pleased that I actually was instrumental myself at the University of Cape Town, UCT Nogal, to have Afrikaans as one of the official languages, whereas people were opposing it, saying that Afrikaans must be at Stellenbosch. So all other universities, and we are supporting, and I am supported, not wearing the pencil pad, supported by pencil, as they do support other universities as well. So that is that role in the academic sector. And obviously in schools, it is supported. Then also you would see that when you're watching either your generations or your soapies and so on, there are Afrikaans speakers. And, some of us were the followers of Sevendeland. Now when we have the Kelders van Geheim, and the people are following that. So, and also when you're watching your generation, or is it Dimo, well, it's no more there, and the others, Afrikaans is included in those languages, because we understand that it is not only the white people that speak the language, it is all of us that use the language. And strange enough, all of us, we follow. And also, lastly, the soapies that are there. It's Turkish soapies, and they play in Afrikaans, but we follow exactly what is happening there, and that is how it is supported.
The geographic spread of the language reaches distant countries. Well, not so distant, but not just exclusive to South Africa, but they are like, as a language, it goes in Namibia. There's a lot of Afrikaans. There's a lot of Afrikaans in Botswana and some other Southern African countries. Is that a consideration in sort of the ways in which programs of the language board go about collaboration across border, which is significant for a cultural experience, I imagine?
Absolutely, we do that. It turns out as the board in some of our strategic areas, as we do, we then partner with any entity outside the borders of this country that in the cross-border languages. And Afrikaans is one of them, like Setswana, Sesotho, but Afrikaans, as you rightfully put it, as a cross-border language, those languages that are spoken elsewhere. So soon I will be going to Namibia, but not about Afrikaans, to do something about the Khoi and San languages that is spoken in Namibia. But then I will do some research and get some ideas about Afrikaans as well. So absolutely, we do then support that, and we promote the cross-border languages, not only Afrikaans, but all other cross-border languages.
Okay. If I'm an Afrikaans speaker in the Northern Cape and I'm not necessarily white, I imagine that there won't be enough resources for those people to meditate, think about their language, which is Afrikaans. Are you able to direct us to any activity that the board will be holding anywhere in the country if people would like to attend?
Well, it's not necessarily the board, but the board normally we join in. You probably missed the first one. On the 21st of February every year, the whole world celebrates International Mother Language Day as declared by UNESCO. So then we join in those celebrations, and then Afrikaans was included. And then also then we will be joining in. We say that there is some concept that started last year on Afrikaans as groot. If you do not get time, please, in November, Afrikaans as groot, it will be celebrated, and then pencils will be represented there. And then again, during the September month, the Heritage Month, when we have the International Translation Day, and that month we then celebrate it. And then lastly, again, in October, we have the Dictionary Day, International Dictionary Day, and then the Afrikaans Dictionary, including all other dictionaries, are included. So there are various festivities as the board that we then support. We put resources there, be it financially, be it otherwise, and in all 9 provinces of our country.
Thank you very much, Chairperson of the Pan South African Language Board, for making time and for holding Professor Lolie Makhubu-Badenhorst. Thanks very much indeed, and all the best.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, and I hope someday we will talk. I know that you asked the previous the professor from UP about the difference between a dialect and a language. I hope someday we will get time and talk about it, because he's a historian and I'm a linguist. I deal with dialects and I deal with languages. So probably we will be able to have a discussion in that regard.
Thank you.
But thank you so much for having me, and then have a wonderful day further.
Same to you, Prof. Thank you, same to you, Prof. Take the news. It's 1100 hours here on Power Talk. We're going to take the news with Nyaka Lotefu.